everybody.
Oh, never mind. No, I didn't mean that.
We'd like to get started. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Chris Patson. I'm the Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, and I am delighted to introduce Hilda Arellano today, who's our speaker. The United States' approach to development assistance, I think, is poised to make a big change in the coming months and years, or at least many of us hope it is. It has been existing on what could be termed starvation rations, USAID, for the past decade or so. And it seems that from a number of directions, USAID may become a much more prominent and central part of our country's approach to national security. In May 2010, President Obama issued a national security strategy that stated that development is the third pillar of national security, equal to diplomacy and defense, and that the three should be integrated and they should mutually reinforce each other. The Global Development Policy Directive issued last month characterizes development as indispensable in the forward defense of America's interests. And the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, which we hope is due out in November, I hear, is expected to further refine this new architecture, including policy review and initiation, resource allocations, implementation and monitoring between state and USAID. So, I think when you look at all of these things that are coming down the pipe, this is an exciting time for those who work at USAID and also for our many students who are really interested in development. And so we're really pleased to have Hilda Arellano here today. She's the counselor to USAID, and she is going to discuss the new policy framework for U.S. development assistance. Before she starts, let me tell you a little bit about her, because she's had a really simply outstanding career of public service in the area of development, even though she didn't go to the Woodrow Wilson School. She's a graduate of Cornell and with a BA in political science, and she has an MA in political science from UT Austin. Prior to joining USAID, she worked for 17 years primarily in Latin America on a wide variety of topics, credit projects for rural women, program evaluation consultant for income generation projects targeted to low-income women, and is a personal service contractor with USAID Bolivia managing rural and non-formal education projects. She joined USAID in 1987. Her first assignments were in Ecuador and Guatemala. And there she rose to become mission director in Ecuador from 1998 to 2001. From 2001 to 2004, she served as mission director for the Regional Services Center for Europe and Eurasia in Hungary. And from 2004 to 2006 in Peru. She then assumed the directorship of USAID Iraq from 2006 to 2007 before her assignment as mission director in Cairo, Egypt, a position she held prior to becoming counselor for USAID. So a really very interesting career path, and maybe people want to ask you questions about how you managed all that. She will speak this afternoon on U.S. development assistance, rethinking and rebuilding the third pillar of national security. So thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here and to see such a great group in front of me. For somebody who has spent most of their career working in development overseas, I would just like to thank those of you who are out here who are studying and researching and thinking and writing about development. You have helped those of us that have not been back in the United States over the years to really look at development from a very different perspective, think more analytically about what we're doing in the field. So the role you play is an especially important one for those of us that are very immersed in country situations and in country contexts. I'd like to thank you for that, and especially thank the students, some of whom I've already met with, who are really inspirational in their commitment to really wanting to find the best way to serve not only their country, but the world in what I think all of us regard as an increasingly complex environment. I've had the pleasure in recent months, as I was just telling Ambassador Bodine, of working with Anne-Marie Slaughter, Dr. Anne-Marie Slaughter, whom you all know very well. She has been, fortunately for us, detailed to Washington, unfortunately for you, but is just doing a fantastic job coordinating what is a major interagency effort trying to move us one step forward on improving our development coordination for the U.S. government. Putting a little bit of context to where USAID is now, and really what I would like to do is build on the building blocks that you laid out, which are the policy directives that have come out in recent months. Talk a little bit about some of the challenges they present for USAID, and then talk about what USAID hopes to do to be able to step up and really respond to what are clearly increasing expectations around the term development and around the concept of development. This is a very challenging time for us. Those of you that have studied the history of USAID know that this is not the first time we have been challenged to move out of our comfort zone and do things that modernize us and make us more competent. But I think the recent, I don't want to say rash, but I will say rash, the recent rash of policy statements, directives, and analyses really put USAID in a very, very specific spot where we are going to, probably more than any other time in our history, have to modernize the way we do business and rethink the way we approach our role in an increasingly complicated interagency construct. We have seen in recent weeks the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Treasury, the USAID administrator, all sitting in front of the Global Leadership Forum talking about development. This has presented to us a very, very serious challenge. They've said that they all want development elevated in the context of national security and foreign policy. The U.S. Congress has told USAID it wants to be more collaborative and cooperative in terms of the way our budget is allocated. As you all know, the purse strings of the USAID budget are with the Congress, so Congress is far and away our most important stakeholder when it comes to budget. But as always, when you're presented with challenges, the devil is in the details. And right now for USAID, the devil is in those details and finding how we can be more responsive. We have the leadership of a very vibrant and intelligent and incredibly energetic, and here I hope I'm not referring to my age, but he really is very, very energetic and very bright administrator. He comes out of the Gates Foundation, comes with a totally different perspective on development, but also, I think, appreciates the role of USAID because as part of the Gates Foundation, worked with USAID in so many of the countries where he was executing programs for Gates. So he brings a mixture of both respect for what AID's possibilities are, but also a very new view of what our potential is. And this is the right person at the right time. Those of you who are in the audience, and I don't see too many of you, most of you are too young to remember, but AID is about to come up upon its 50-year anniversary. We were established in a letter that President Kennedy sent to the Congress in 1961, setting up the Agency for International Development. The President's policy statement, which came out just a little over a month ago at the UN General Assembly, was the most recent time in history since that letter that there had been a major policy directive on development from a president. So that 50-year gap really has seen USAID go through tremendous ups and downs and challenges. Those of us who were alive and remember what the Vietnam War meant for USAID, subsequent to that, the rise of emerging markets, and the whole focus on basic human needs in the 70s and then in the 80s. The fall of the Berlin Wall, when we opened 35 missions in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe from one day to the next, without a whole lot of extra budget support. This represented an incredible challenge. And then finally, the policy shockwaves that followed 9/11. For an agency that was reduced in size, already spread too thin all over the world, and subsequently had to deploy to a number of countries that we had not worked in ever, or were seriously downsized in if we had worked in there before, including Pakistan and Afghanistan. So all of the vision, the mission, the moving forward that we're now looking at is building on that past, but also trying to address the challenge that we've been given. The president, in a sense, has thrown down a gauntlet. He has said in his statement that he wants to reestablish USAID as the preeminent bilateral development agency. We recognize that meeting that expectation is going to take a lot of effort on a lot of people's parts. It won't be done overnight. It will not happen in a day. And hopefully it will be done with the cooperation and the contributions of some of you who are in this room. I certainly hope so. And I know from my conversations at lunchtime, some of you already are making those contributions. And I can tell you as counselors to the agency, that means a tremendous amount to me personally. I'd like to just cite some elements of the national security strategy that was released in May that I think are relevant to the future of AID. Then I'll comment on some elements of the development policy paper that the president released at the UN General Assembly and how those relate to AID. And finally, I'll do a very brief statement of what USAID is currently working on as part of its reform agenda to be able to better step up to the plate and meet these challenges. The president's national security determination doesn't really focus, the president's national security strategy does not really focus specifically on development, but it touches on development throughout. And it really is the initial building block for the policy environment that we are now facing. It talks very seriously about comprehensive global engagement. This is a centerpiece, as all of you know, of the Obama administration, building on mutual interests and mutual respect, and leading to what they call a just and sustainable new international order. I was in Cairo for the Cairo speech when the president came out to do his address to the Muslim world, and it was clear after that speech that a new expectation had been laid down. The issue of how we meet that expectation when you do start that kind of outreach engagement is something that we still are working on and trying to respond to. Clearly, saying that the United States wants to be more engaged in the world, that our engagement in the world will impact on security, and that development will be an important part of that engagement, presents very, very specific challenges. What we are seeing as a result of the development of the national security strategy and within the USAID State Department relationship really is an attempt to make sure that there is something of a rebalancing in the engagement between civilian and military engagement. Having served in Iraq, this was a constant theme of discussion there, both with the military and civilian leadership in Baghdad. But this really, as we do re-engage and as we do try to engage more fully throughout the world, how do we make sure that the civilian part of that engagement is really a strong suit and really contributing? The other part that is cited in the national security strategy that I think we also consider very important is the need to cooperate more fully with other donors and other countries that are engaged in the world. one of the things you will hear today in the donor community is how they're very glad that the U.S. is back. I think our reluctance for a number of years to talk about the Paris Declaration, our reluctance to really refer to the need to discuss how we're more effective as donors, how we make our development programs more part of a coherent, coordinated effort, did not sit well in some places. And so this renewed engagement that does include more active donor engagement, I can tell you as mission director, spend an inordinate amount of time in meetings with other donors, and in Egypt there are many donors and large donors, so it's a lot of time. But there is a growing satisfaction in the donor community because the U.S. is willing to discuss its role and also discuss how we try not to duplicate and how we work better together with other donors. These areas of the national security policy, the enhanced engagement, the rebalancing of the civilian and military to ensure that the civilian piece is a major piece of engagement, and then the opening up of dialogue at all levels as we re-engage in many parts of the world, really have fed directly into the President's policy on global development. The President's policy, as many of you know, was released for the first time at the General Assembly. It generally elevates development as a central pillar of national security. It makes the very direct linkage that the national security strategy did not make. It stresses the importance that development be intimately and intricately linked to national security. As you can imagine, for USAID, this presents a series of challenges because there are environments in the world where that linkage between development and security is a more direct one. There are parts of the world where it is less direct and where it really is up to us to make sure that development remains relevant even though there may not be so much focus on that environment. As you know, USAID works in many countries, all regions of the world. Some of our missions are extremely large, but we also have relatively small presences in other places. There are three primary pillars to the global development policy. One of them is sustainable development outcomes. This really is where USAID has been forced to do a lot of soul searching because it does reflect a perception that much of what we have done either is not sustainable or could have been done in a way that ensures greater sustainability. Under sustainable development outcomes, there is a real focus on broad-based economic growth and democratic governance as the top priorities that will accelerate development and eradicate poverty. Those really are the centerpieces of the development policy, even though it recognizes other initiatives that, and all of you know that there's a very active focus on health, on feed the future, on agriculture, et cetera. But really the centerpieces that jumped out at us in AID are the broad-based economic growth focus and the democratic governance focus, primarily because these are two areas of our budget where very often we have to fight the hardest for resources. We have a lot of earmarks in our budget. We have vast health earmarks, vast education earmarks, but where we very often have limited resources is in the area of economic growth and in the area of democratic governance. So that pillar of the development, the global development policy really stood out for us. It also talks about fostering innovation and bringing science and technology more to the table in development. There is a recognition, I think, or I'd like to think, a recognition that USAID and many of the projects that we have worked on over the years have developed innovative technologies, have used harness science and technology. We have agreements with universities that are active all over the world in very specific areas. But I also think it's highlighting a real failing. And we are not the only agency that has this failing or the only institution that has this failing. What we do not do well is share information and scale up. And the real challenge in the policy is really to take innovation in science and technology and scale them up to a level where they become more serious contributors to the development equation. This is, we're starting to look at this. We're starting to do it. We have very important health technologies, innovative business practices, but these are areas where, to meet the president's challenge, we are really going to have to do more. And finally, the determination recommends that where we are working in crisis environments and what are called high threat environments, we ensure that what we do is linked downstream to permanent a transition to a more permanent development policy, a more permanent development activity, that it not be viewed as, a one-off, get in, get out. As soon as the crisis is over, we run for the door. But that when we're planning development programs in a crisis, we ensure we have the elements that connect to what will happen downstream after the crisis is over and in the post-conflict environment. And I'm sure you'll have lots of questions about that in the question and answer period. The president's policy also talks about a new operational model. Just to list, and I think more than anything, this represents a shifting institutional focus. It refers to selectivity, that we can't be everywhere in the world, that we need to select carefully where we function and why we're there. It talks about country ownership and accountability, that we need to insist that where we are working, as we often say at our missions, they want it more than we do. It's not USAID or the US government out there forcing people to do things that they really don't want to do, because we know where that winds up. We know that it either winds up with us funding those activities permanently, or with the minute we stop funding them, the activities are not sustainable. So country ownership and accountability is a critical element. Prioritizing partnerships with the private sector, with other non-traditional partners, other agencies, other non-governmental organizations, diaspora communities, groups that we've worked with, but not in a concerted enough fashion. And finally, strengthening key multilateral capabilities. The president's policy really stresses the importance that the underpinning of the multilateral community and the U.S. contributions to the multilateral community really must be part of how the U.S. views the development equation, so that we make sure we are not duplicating efforts of the regional banks, of the World Bank, of the UN system, et cetera. So that multilateral engagement theme comes up again. And finally, he talks about, and this is probably for USAID the greatest challenge, he talks about a modern architecture for development, which is a fascinating concept, because you envision a modern home with lots of windows and you're not sure where the pillars are. But the term modern architecture, we're still grappling with what this means for USAID, because anyway, I'll have a visual on that the next time I have to give a presentation like this. He basically lays out 4 elements. One of them, and this is definitely one of the most complicated and challenging, is elevating development so that development impacts are considered on equal footing with other strategic considerations. This, as you can imagine, for us is a major challenge, and at the end I'll mention some of the challenges. When we're told to elevate development, what do we mean by it? And how do we make sure that what we do in development really is able to go toe-to-toe with other strategic considerations, either in a national security environment or in a diplomatic environment. And the support we get from the State Department, the support we get from the Department of Defense is only valid to the extent that we really can be there, step up, and make sure those development contributions are holding their very own weight. The second is a cross-government integrated approach. This, within a modern architecture, is what we fondly call whole of government. It means that USAID cannot be out there on its own. It means that probably most USAID employees today spend as much time with colleagues from other agencies as they do with their own colleagues at the USAID mission. It means when USAID goes out and talks about trade-related growth, we may have, as Shannon and I were discussing before, a very good project in Peru that produces small peppers to sell to the Tabasco company in Louisiana, McElhaney's Tabasco sauce. And we looked all over the Andes to find those, those perfect environments where you could produce just the pepper they needed. But what does that mean in the context of a country that is negotiating a free trade agreement with the United States, as Peru was at the time? What does it mean in terms of labor rights? What does it mean in terms of standards, in terms of sanitary standards, et cetera? So in other words, it's not just that development piece, but it's the way that development piece links to what other people are doing. For example, in a place as easy to work in as Iraq, it was making sure that our agriculture programs were fully coordinated with what Department of Defense was doing and planning in those environments to ensure that we did not get crosswise or in the crosshairs of something that we should not be involved in or we didn't want to even get close to. That second piece of this modern architecture, which is this intensive interagency architecture, is something that really presents a challenge for us. And the third element, and I mentioned this before, is really forging a new partnership with the Congress. One of the, if you ask anybody who works for USAID in the world what one of their largest challenges is, usually it's the fact that we don't get our budget until, the 11th hour, and when we get it, it has a list of things that really, both institutions, earmarks, and other things that really reflect, I would say, a lack of full confidence and trust in the relationship between the government's primary development, international development agency, and the Congress. We are earmarked. Usually we have countries in the world where 90% of our budget comes through earmarks. So that relationship with the Congress, so we can make sure that they trust us to do the kind of development that really needs to be done, and at the same time gives USAID the ability to plan and project and strategize based on analytical information about quality development programs is really something that needs to be a major challenge under this modern architecture. I'll conclude by briefly talking about how USAID plans to address the fourth challenge of which really is rebuilding USAID. Believe it or not, there is a pillar in the modern architecture that talks about rebuilding USAID. So the building metaphor goes on, the architecture metaphor goes on, and I still don't have the visual on this. But let me talk a little bit about what it is we're worrying about right now. And it goes back a little bit to where we started. During the transition period between the election in 2008 and President Obama's taking office, I think there was a little bit of a wake-up call within USAID as we met with the transition team. It had been 8 years with a very, very heavy focus on Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan following 9/11. There had been a lot of turmoil in the development community, as you know, not just USAID, the development community writ large, those of you that study development, people who talk about development, and Brookings Institute and other think tanks that think about development. There had been a lot of questioning as to where USAID really was going. And I think some of those conversations really raised issues within the USAID community that allowed us to see that we were going to have to come up with a series of reforms, a series of major changes, and try to move those forward. As you can imagine, in a government bureaucracy that is managing, last year we obligated more money. In other words, we put into agreements more money than any time in our history. It was over $18 billion. This was much more than the year before, much more than the year prior to that, and way over what we had had 10 years before, without a whole lot more staff. So trying to engage in a reform agenda when you have really very limited institutional capacity in place is, as they say, rebuilding the plane while you're flying it. But we are focusing, and we have come up with an agenda that we are calling USAID Forward, because we do not want it to drag us backward. We want it to move us forward. We have an agenda of 7 areas that we are currently working on that we think will help modernize our architecture and enable us to meet some of these expectations that are out there. The first is in the area of procurement reform. This is in the way we do grants and contracts. There has been tremendous frustration in many places on the way USAID contracting mechanisms have functioned in recent years. But one of our responses, and you can, I think, understand this, I should have thought about, I guess it's like when you have a pot and more people are coming over for dinner, what you do is you just load more into that pot and probably serve less quality dinner, but you are able to feed the people that are there. As we've gotten a larger budget and had no increase in staff, what we have done is done larger and larger implementing mechanisms. We have been criticized on the Hill. We have been criticized as a result of the Paris Declaration for that process. Under procurement reform, we are looking at building out a much greater expanded variety of partnerships with a wider variety of organizations. We are looking at reducing the time and the length of time and some of our requirements to do our contracting procedures. We are looking at working much more closely with host country governments through their systems and putting more money into host country systems and the systems that governments have. As you can imagine, this is extremely controversial and extremely challenging, particularly where the country's financial systems are not up to par. But that is one of the pillars of procurement reform. In other words, we would work with a greater variety of partners. We would build local organizations, and the major focus of building organizations would be to basically work ourselves out of a job. Do the development of those organizations so that we are no longer necessary or needed. We have a major focus on talent management. The primary component of this is over the last 3 years, we have hired 620 new officers at last count. Some of them are mid-level hires, people that had worked for USAID and the development community before, but the greatest number are students, many like yourselves, with experience and a commitment to working overseas and working in international development. The plan is to double that number in the next 2.5 years, and in so doing, double the size of the Foreign Service in USAID. When this process started, USAID was down to about 1,200 officers. A lot of this, most of it driven by budget constraints. that came out of the 1990s, the Balanced Budget Act, et cetera. 1,200 officers. Today, we are closing in on, because we have a variety of mechanisms, not just new hires, we are at about 2,000. But during the war in Vietnam, just to give you an idea of how things change, we had 12,000 officers in Vietnam alone. So times change, and but now we are very, very thrilled. I've talked with all of these classes that have come, since I arrived from Cairo in July. I've met with 4 classes of new officers, and they're an exciting group. The last group I met with last week spoke 34 languages in the room. You had people who were able to speak of 34 languages. I mean, it's a very exciting time for us. But as I say, it is building the plane while you're flying it. And hopefully they understand that, will be patient, and will really want to stick with us. We're rebuilding policy capacity. We're rebuilding budget capacity. We have relinquished our budget capacity and our policy capacity to the State Department in 2006 when the Bureau for Foreign Assistance was created in the State Department under Administrator Tobias. We are now rebuilding that. We've established a new bureau called Policy Planning and Learning. It is developing country-based strategies. It is developing a policy white paper on development for the agency. It is really trying to lay down the building blocks of reinstating development policy inside USAID. Within that, we also have a new monitoring and evaluation focus. The idea is to bring back more of the fact-based design and planning that we used to be rather well known for. But in recent years, because so much of our budget system has been based on inputs rather than outputs and impact, we really have receded into more of a focus on inputs rather than ultimate outcomes. So we are trying to reinstate this. We have a monitoring and evaluation requirement that will be coming out in the next couple of months that is going to have to be integrated into every agreement we sign. So we're really excited about that. One of the most frustrating things, having been in the field, was in the field there really is a fair amount of evaluation that goes on. The problem is, as the field perceived that Washington was less interested in evaluation, very often we weren't sharing evaluations with Washington. Missions were just sitting on these evaluations and not sharing them. And so we not only do we have to reinstate monitoring and evaluation, but play catch up with all of the good evaluations that have been going on in recent years and make sure that that data is available. Rebuilding budget management. Some people would say this is the most important. It is. It is a gradual process, especially now that there is an interagency assistance budget done at the State Department. This year's budget, USAID was able to take back a series of activities and budget proposals so that the budget that went forward to the Secretary was really regarded as a joint budget, but with a very strong USAID component. For 2012, we will be presenting an integrated USAID budget, a corporate USAID budget, to the Secretary for the first time since 2006. This is a big step. We're really looking forward to being able to do that because, as you know, strategy should drive budget, but if you don't have budget authority, why do strategy? And I know that's not a good statement, and I should not probably have even made that comment, but but really, what the lack of control over your budget does is it drives a lack of willingness or a lack of interest in really thinking strategically. And so I think recapturing some of this really is at least setting up a level of enthusiasm, particularly for the country-based strategies that now are going to be piloted. For 2011, we will be doing 40% of our budget against country-based strategies, and that is a goal the administrator has laid out. And finally, I'd just like to comment on science and technology and innovation. enough cannot be said about the changes that people have been going through in recent years in this regard, and how there is a real need to recapture this within the development community and specifically with USAID. We are creating specific funds for innovation ventures so that innovators throughout the world can present their proposals. We received 100 proposals against an announcement 2 months ago, and 13 of those have already been funded, and we're looking forward to receiving more. And then in the area of science and technology, really here the goal is to harness the scientific community in the United States at the service of development. There are great thinkers and there's great thinking going on all over the country in technologies and scientific developments that apply directly to the development world. And this is something that we're extremely excited about, and hopefully we'll be able to get the funding that we're requesting from Congress. Again, much of this is driven by budget, and that will now allow me to wrap up and hand it over to you for questions. I'd just like to talk about what I see as 4 challenges we are going to face in making this real. One of them is going to be budget and political timing. It goes without saying that we are facing a very difficult budget scenario for the federal government starting in 2011, but especially 2012. So what we will be doing is flying the plane, or rebuilding the plane while flying, and hoping that we have enough gasoline to keep it aloft. I think enough of that metaphor, but really the budget reality really is one that I don't think it will stop us from doing things. What it may change is the pace with which we do things. Second, trying to make sure that people have the patience to allow us to do this. You can imagine with wars going on in several places right now, but in places that are extremely high pressure and high profile, to rebuild our capacity while there is such pressure coming from those quarters is difficult for an agency. We were talking over lunch about how AID, just in Afghanistan alone, currently has 300 foreign service officers, which is more than we have, definitely more than we have in all of Latin America, and probably edging up on what we have in all of Africa, which is a priority region for this administration. So having that number of people dedicated to one country and one high priority country is a stress. We are hoping that people will have patience to recognize that to really be an equal pillar in this endeavor with the Department of Defense, with Department of State, we will be allowed the time to do what we need to do. And finally, I would just like to, I think probably our greatest challenge, and I'll close here, there is a lot of talk about development being an equal player with defense and diplomacy. The question for us is really being able to meet that expectation and produce the results that allow people to regard us in that way. In other words, is development capable of stepping up in a way that truly is of equal import, of equal profile as the importance given to diplomacy and defense? This is no small challenge. Having had this experience in countries where we work directly with the U.S. military, where we work directly with Department of State, it is an ongoing issue. Is helping people, is saving lives, is elevating incomes, is building institutions equally important when the other priorities of stabilization are so overwhelmingly urgent? So I think this may be our major challenge, which is to prove that those things do contribute to stabilization, do contribute to better environments to live in and work in, and do draw people away from things that deteriorate countries and make them unstable. Thanks for bearing with me. As you probably can tell, these are topics that are much on our minds these days. We are facing many, many challenges, but with the support and the help and the thoughts from people like you, I hope we'll be able to do a better job of meeting them. So thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Hilda. I'm working for the government of Japan, regarding of Japan. And the government of Japan is also facing the budgetary deficit and political conditions. And we've been trying to increase the public awareness of the importance of the official justice. And I would like to ask you how the USAID is approaching to this public society for increasing their understanding on how building the issue of countries, and how you are what kind of approach and what kind of rhetoric to debate development issues to the U.S.
Well, I think, you know, your question is the major one in terms of public support. USAID traditionally has been a very little known agency. We are known, for example, when there's an earthquake in Haiti and people see the USAID logo on, be it bags of wheat, be it tents, be it materials that are handed over. There has been a much more active outreach program over the last decade, but unfortunately, and having been part of a lot of, you know, whenever I would come home from overseas, I was sent out to talk at communities and universities, et cetera. The U.S. public is very polarized on foreign assistance. It tends to really either understand it well and believe that it is important, or be very set against it. It's almost like there's very little in the middle. People do not relate closely. They relate when there is something like Haiti, the overwhelming outpouring of support for after the earthquake in Haiti. The tsunami was another example where people could make that link. But on a daily basis, and I have no answer here because we have tried everything, getting people to understand the importance of the medium to long-term development issues of building institutions, of making sure that countries, you know, the countries, we talk about Costa Rica, we talk about Chile, we talk about South Korea, we talk about the countries that USAID graduated, most of Eastern Europe, many of the new European accession, EU accession countries. That is a very hard argument to sell. The more the medium to long-term commitment to development is a harder argument to sell. In some communities, university communities, it resonates. But with the average person on the street, I would say what resonates is more the humanitarian assistance. I know that's not an answer to your question, but I'm not sure there is an answer, frankly, or an easy one. Yes?
Hi, my name is Ever Delgado. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very happy that you mentioned that you guys have sort of a new directive for impact evaluation, just monitoring and evaluation in general. So I wanted to ask you, what are some of the strategies for formulating tools for monitoring and evaluation? And also with regards to the fact that there might be some inertia or internal resistance to this process, how are you guys handling those issues?
Okay, Eric. On the tools, we have a team now in place that's led by Dr. Ruth Levine. She is in charge. She is working with USAID now as a USAID employee, and she is heading up a team that is developing a new directive on development. related to the use of data, the way we collect data, and the standards, more than anything, the standards that we have used. And I don't want to get into the toolkit. There will be a toolkit that will be available before the end of December. It's going to look at evaluations from a series of different areas, both the community level direct impact, but also how does impact add up and that the sum of the parts really amount to a higher level of impact. So what we are looking at really is reformulating evaluation as a policy for the agency. And as I said before, it will now become an obligatory part of all project design. And the data collection will be an obligatory part of every contract and grant that we give out. I think it's that, following up and down the food chain really is where the most important thing, the most important impact is going to be. But related to the importance of evaluation, at the end of the day, it really is about feeding it back into policy and design. One of the issues we deal with in foreign policy is that foreign policy very often is a statement of intent. So development policy has a hard time being at an equal level with that, because what development policy needs to be about is what we know works, frankly. Not just what we know is needed, but also what we know works. And this is the key, I think, that we have not done with, as well with monitoring and evaluation. We have not used our M&E systems to really develop not only those policies, but also those designs that reflect both the failures, what we know didn't work, but also what we know works. On your second question, resistance. Stonewalling, as they say, waiting it out, because one of the things, as you know, in many government organizations, the easiest thing is to just kind of stay in place and wait for things to pass and hope that they'll go back to where they were before. We have a really, really aggressive outreach effort now within USAID. Before the end of the year, we're traveling to meet with every mission director. We have had 2 town hall meetings with everybody. We're laying out very, very specific benchmarks for achievement, and really trying to get at the issues that keep people from really getting on board with the reform agenda. I'll tell you that one of the major reasons is that people are so overworked already. So they see a reform agenda as giving them more work, and part of the reform agenda is a streamlining exercise that is looking at all of states and aids planning processes and reporting processes and trying to cut back on those. So it's kind of, we're hoping that the credibility of the effort will be maintained, but you've identified, as you know, there is nothing more difficult than change management, because change management depends on having everybody with you. It's a good point. Yes.
When I look at the figures, it seems like the USAID share of the total US bilateral ODA pie has fallen to historic lows, from about 85% at the end of the Cold War to now about 45% as ODA has grown. So state and defense have taken quite a bit of the pie. Do you view the F process as the hand that kind of robs USAID's purse?
Well, if we were a fully staffed, robust, with lots of contract officers and financial managers, et cetera, ready to take on the mega challenges of today, I might have a different answer to your question. Frankly, I gave you the figure of 18 billion that we put into grants and contracts last year. For us, this is monumental. I mean, the closest figure I could get for before 9/11 was a little over 8 billion. I need to go back and make sure that's the right figure. But to have gone from putting 8 billion in to putting 18 billion in, with virtually no real increase in staff. I cannot tell you how astounded my military colleagues were in Iraq when I would tell them how many officers USAID had. Total, worldwide. It was mind-boggling. we have 8,600 people working for USAID worldwide, and of those, 4,500 or a little bit higher are our Foreign Service national staff who do not have security clearances. These are our local staff that are the bread and butter of what we do. So I think in terms of what we can handle budgetarily in a world where clearly development, I mean, the amount, as you say, the amount of money is much larger going in. What concerns us with that equation is the development focus. Because that you're giving foreign assistance figures.
Those are ODA figures.
Well, yeah, but a lot of that does not go for development.
Okay.
Per se. The issue of really making sure that development is at the table, I'll give another experience from Iraq. I mean, one of the hardest fights we had when we were planning during the surge was really making sure, as we mentioned before, that everything we were doing had a downstream planning implication, because we knew that the activities were going to have to last out 2-3 years. No matter what the situation was in security, the development equation was going to have to continue. And one of the things I think is clear, and part of this is because of the strategy issue and the loss of really strategic power within the agency, one of the things that is clear is that the development focus of ODA has been weakened. Not just the USAID portion, but overall. And I think this is a real challenge for all of us working with those funds, because the national security strategy really brings other actors to the table, not just us, to do development. So, yeah.
Can you talk about lessons learned and future goals in Haiti? And I asked this specifically, the MPA-1 students are going to do a simulation at the end of the semester on Haiti. If you have any relevant publications or anything you would like to share with us, we're really interested in the subject.
Can we talk about this afterward?
Yes, ma'am.
I have not been, because I had nothing to do with Haiti, and I don't want to misspeak here. But there was the lessons learned exercise, as you know, I'm sure. And there is a lessons learned document coming out. So we can talk about that. I'd rather be specific rather than general.
No, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Good. Yeah.
Could you talk briefly from your perspective, if a person is considering trying to work for USAID versus working for one of the nonprofit or for-profit contractors, what would you say are the rewards out in the field versus choosing one of those alternate paths?
Yeah. That's an excellent question. Actually, we were talking.
I was hoping that would be a softball.
I think when you work in USAID, I joined AID late in life. I'd done a lot in development before I joined AID, and and a lot of people, and I think somebody today asked me, why did I do this? What really interested me, where I saw the difference, was really the ability to link something to a greater whole. And I think that is the major difference that you're looking at. And challenging. I mean, you can imagine how challenging it is, especially in today's world. I mean, that figure of us only getting 45% of ODA says a lot about the interagency working environment. But I think it really is about trying to understand how development contributes to something larger, no matter what the context. I mean, there are foreign policy priorities vary tremendously by country. For example, in Peru, where Shannon's been working, you're talking about a program that's primarily been driven by counter-narcotics from a funding standpoint, Plan Colombia, et cetera. But what you've done is you've taken the budget and tried to use it not for development, making, and a lot of that was geographic targeting into the areas that were more vulnerable for drug production and processing and marketing. Job creation, where you have a threat of just large numbers of young males looking for work. It's very hard to compete with that market, but if you have a more permanent job market, et cetera. So I think it really what for me is the point when you've done something very specific in development and you start to look at the roadblocks. It's what Kim and I were talking about before related to, the malaria work you did in Tanzania. Really, how do you link that to a broader challenge, a policy challenge, and have that, sort of mutual reinforcement going on? The analysis you have to do, the thinking you have to do. I just found that I was ready for that challenge. So, I don't know whether that's an answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know a whole lot about the Millennium Challenge Corporation, but you mentioned that 40% of the budgets under this administration are trying to be targeted on country-led strategies. So I'm wondering what the overlap is.
With the MCC.
Yeah, with the MCC.
Yeah, I'd have to look at the list again. There are some that are MCC countries, but they're trying to stay away from the MCC countries on the country-led strategies. There's a real interrelationship, as you know, between AID. A lot of the preliminary programs for the MCC are managed by USAID. And because those lay down very clear policy markers, in some ways it's better for us to not do strategies where the MCC is already engaged in compact development. So, but I could give you the actual individual countries and whether they are. Okay. Yeah.
As you're rolling out this agenda, to what extent do you have to think about how future presidential administrations might come in and ask for a different agenda? Is that a major concern?
What can I say? I think it's always in the back of your mind because we have been through, as I said at the beginning, just a tremendous amount of up and down and back and forth on the role of the agency, the importance of the agency. That's a whole other discussion. But there is one of the most important things for what I talked about under the 7-point agenda is that there is bipartisan support for this. From Senator Lugar, from Senator Kerry, from the House side, Representative Lowy, and others on the Republican side. It's kind of a summation of complaints Congress has had and others have had about USAID operations for quite some time. So we're hoping, it is really politically neutral in most ways. There's very little about it and it is responsive to, as I say, comments, complaints that we've heard about the agency for, well over a decade now. So I'm assuming that this agenda really reflects what happened to the agency following both the fall of the Berlin Wall, but even more importantly, the Balanced Budget Act, and then after 9/11, which really have been three major, I won't say traumas, but sort of bellwethers for us. So.
I have two questions. The first one was you just said something about the MCC and cooperation with the MCC. My question is, a lot of people that I've read about in blogs were saying that there's already such an abundance of agencies and there's a big muddle going on, and the U.S. development program really just needs to focus and really just needs to cooperate and make it, well, not really one big agency, but why have 21 agencies involved in all of this? So that would be my first question. And the second question would be, you said that it's supposed to, or that USAID is supposed to be the third pillar, or development is previously the third pillar of national security, but I've read that this is supposed to be a rather big problem if USAID is not really receiving a permanent seat in the National Security Council, and as well, in comparison to obviously defense and diplomacy. And that would be the second question. My third would be, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, well then cancel the first one. Some projects were maybe less measurable than others, and I read that especially some projects that are less measurable, like they are probably less measurable, but in the end probably better or more effective than others. So how are you actually going to use those potentially good projects that are less measurable when you say you're going to implement
M&E,
yeah,
the monitoring
you're
evaluation.
going to have projects that are very measurable, and you're going to require that to be a part of each
Right.
project.
Yeah, I'll start with the first one. I think there is very little probability there will be one mega development agency that has charge of all development activities. This is a direct offshoot, I think, of increasing interest in engaging in the world. You have, our administrator says this very well. Most of us who were involved in development in the 70s, you would get the development community together in a room and they would fit around that table. Today it would look more like this. And it's not just U.S. government agencies. I mean, there is just an intense recognition that development is something that people want to be a part of. Department of Education is engaged overseas. The CDC is engaged overseas. HHS, Department of Defense. The list is very, very long. Each of them have their own international appropriation. Department of Justice, FBI, DEA. They all have their own international focus, and it would be very, very difficult. The issue is the one that I raised. How do you make sure that this is coordinated in a way that does not do damage? One of the things, so the impact is not a harmful one. One of the things that is clear for USAID, and I think it does differentiate us in some ways, is that USAID's mandate really is about changing the environment in the country and helping the country, while we are attached to a national security objective and a foreign policy context, our piece of it is really looking at the country needs. Not so much keen off the specific U.S. interest, which is why your question is such a good one as to why there isn't always buy-in to development, because development really is more about that context as opposed to other areas which may be more about specific interests. So I think all this to say it's going to be tough. On monitoring evaluation, we're talking a lot about this because there is a lot that is not measurable and is anecdotal. How do you measure a policy change? How do you measure a policy context? How do you evaluate an activity that has laid the groundwork for a major decision change related to human rights or related to empowering women that really is more of a decision than impact on the ground? And so there are lots of ways change happens in countries and how the M&E systems can pick up on that, not just the quantifiable. So it's a very good question. Your second one I blocked out, so it must have been especially difficult.
It was about the deceit in the national security.
Yeah. The administrator of USAID is actively involved in the National Security Council. He is on any issue that is relevant where USAID is a player. He is with the president, he is with the vice president, etc. He reports to the Secretary of State. That is the structure within which he works. But the way the security structure works, he is there this week 3 times at major decision-making meetings, major discussion sessions. So I would not, this is something that really has changed in recent years, and especially in the last 2 years has changed dramatically. The amount to which not just he but other people in USAID spend a lot of time involved in national security considerations.
Would you like to take one more?
One more.
Yeah.
Okay.
Having spent a little time in the field, this is kind of a question based on anecdotal but the general perception among implementing NGOs is that if you pay lip service to a few buzzwords in your proposal, you'll probably get the contract, and then the donor doesn't really want to hear from you until you submit a report showing that you're achieving your indicators, and everyone's happy. I suppose the problem being that implementers aren't held very accountable by donors to their action. And again, this is very anecdotal, but USAID in particular has a reputation for kind of never ever visiting. Is this something that the agency is aware of and thinking about,
Well, one of the major reasons that we're talking about the rebuilding is for that very reason. It is a major criticism that the bureaucracy, we become so surrounded and overwhelmed by our own bureaucratic requirements, et cetera. Having said that, I think it is an overstatement in terms of never going anywhere to see whether anything is happening. I do not think we do it as much as we should, especially our U.S. staff. In recent years, what we have done is delegated a lot of this to our Foreign Service national staff and left the U.S. staff to handle the bureaucracy, the auditors, the interagency issues with other agencies at the embassy, with the donor community, et cetera. And a lot of that is just staffing resources. But as I think back on the missions where I've worked, which have been very large missions, very complicated programs, people do spend, I would say, a fair amount of time in the field. What for us is the most frustrating is, and I said this when we were talking about procurement reform, is the fact that we have had to farm so much out under large contracts just because the resources, there were such vast resources. And to get those mechanisms in place, moving, saving children, delivering vaccines, delivering food, tents, whatever, we have defaulted to a way of working that we really do hope to change. But I would like to ask Shannon she's been in Lima. I don't know what your feeling is either, Kim, from what you saw in Tanzania. Those Lima I know very well, but I'd like to hear,
So how often the
Yeah,
U.S.
I mean, what does the American staff get out?
Twice in the 2 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say my experience, I work at the USAID mission in Lima, and U.S. staff is traveling fairly regularly. I would say 2 to 3 trips a month for the office chiefs. Now that doesn't mean that they'll get to every project every month. The difference is that the U.S. staff is limited in the time they can spend in the field. So I would say trips are shorter than they otherwise would be than, say, a contractor who may do a week-long supervisory or evaluation trip. A U.S. service officer doesn't necessarily have the liberty to spend so much time there, but they do get out in the field.
Yeah, but the other thing that has changed in recent years is, particularly in the high threat security environments, we have really come up upon an issue that we simply never had to deal with before. And one of the things you're referring to in Peru, because a lot of the work is focused in coca growing areas, is security limitations for American staff in visiting. And then also in the high threat environments, this is a real issue. What we're trying to do is make sure that that stays in those specific environments and doesn't spill over into a way of doing business. So everybody thinks they don't have to get out of the building and you can just become sort of a desk-bound bureaucrat. But what you're citing is a major challenge for us. I think the anecdotes don't reflect the truth as much as they should. I think our local staff who are professionals, many of them better trained than the American staffs. In some cases, they've got masters, they've got PhDs, would take offense a little bit because they are out there. They speak the languages, especially in countries where we do not train people in languages. But it is a very complicated reality, and it's one that we definitely are trying to respond to because, as you said, perception is the truth in today's world. So we're trying to address that. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much.